All right, welcome back. Harmless Dave here for the Harmless Dave podcast, talking about real music in real time for a few real people out there just like you and me. Don't forget, I'm pointing at you right now, even though you can't see it. This episode being brought to you by the brand new album by the Revolution Saints. No, they're not paying me. This is not a paid advertisement, but the new Rev Saints album, Eagle Flight. Pre-order it now. You won't be disappointed if you're a fan of Whitesnake, Journey, and some other influences in there. A little more edgy than their prior albums. So if you want to kick it up a notch there, and Dean sounding just like Dean. He's not trying to sing like anybody else. He's just being himself, and it's well done. I've got a copy of it, at least an audio version of it, and it sounds amazing, incredible, better than I looked the other day when I got indicted, and that I can tell you. Anyway, speaking of being indicted, former Kiss guitarist Ace Frehley says he has heard from Paul Stanley. He heard from him after demanding an apology, but the conversation was very brief. Ace Frehley says Kiss frontman Paul Stanley called and said, F you, and then hung up the phone. There's a lot of love and a lot of civility right now in these aging rock bands, and it's very comical. By the way, it's very smart for Ace Frehley to kind of gin up some controversy. And if Paul Stanley did call him and hang up, that's fantastic. Maybe he didn't, but who knows, right? Frehley recently took umbrage with Stanley insulting him and former drummer Peter Criss on a recent Kiss appearance via the Howard Stern XM radio show. Now, what's interesting is that if you go on Stern, you have to throw some bombs, because otherwise, what is that show about? What is it about? Are they going to talk about the intricacies of great guitar work? Are they going to talk about any up-and-coming new artist? No. They're going to air the dirty laundry from the past, and Stern set this up by asking Paul Stanley, again, how many years later, why Peter Criss and Ace Frehley weren't at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2014, and Stanley chose to take the low road. He says here, if you saw people on stage who looked like Kiss but sounded like that, maybe we should be called Piss. Okay, and this is what set Ace Frehley off. By the way, neither of these two gentlemen have been invited to come back for the End of the Road, never-ending End of the Road tour, which Gene Simmons has said, I wouldn't mind playing Las Vegas at some point, again, after the End of the Road ends. So it's never the end of the road, especially if you live in Vegas, because then you can go see bands well into their 90s, probably. Frehley later told Sirius XM's Trunk Nation that if he didn't get an apology for the remark, he would release a dossier. It's a Russian dossier. Maybe, Frehley took some cues from Hillary Clinton, right? Well, that I can tell you it's probably true. Okay, Frehley, very smart man. And I think Frehley is actually pro-Donald Trump, which is interesting. I don't know if he has said anything lately about Trump, but I think he was pro-Trump for a while. And of course, the rock media made fun of him endlessly for supporting Donald Trump, because nobody in the rock media supports Donald Trump. You have to do cut and paste journalism. Anytime anyone says, hey, I don't mind Donald Trump, well, here are all the things that Trump's done. Would they ever do that if somebody said they liked Joe Biden? Would any media person come forward and do cut and paste journalism about how great Joe Biden is to rebut someone who came along and said, I don't really like Joe Biden? Well, they might actually rebut with positive remarks. But if somebody said they liked Joe Biden, for instance, if Paul Stanley came out and said, I really like Joe Biden, they wouldn't fact check Paul Stanley. They would not say, oh, really? Well, here are all the things that Biden's done. Rising inflation, horrible economy, interest rates going through the roof, gas prices going through the roof, are standing around the world, which is just ridiculous. And a guy, by the way, who's barely functional in the Oval Office. I mean, last year at this time, I think the Easter Bunny was telling Joe Biden where to go because he didn't know what to do once the kids were finished, rolling or finding the eggs. Maybe this year will be different. Maybe Joe will just stay in the basement. Anyway, getting back to Frehley and Paul Stanley, Frehley says he has a 120-page dossier of dirt on Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons that he keeps in a safety deposit box. It's valuable. That's like a manuscript, right? 120-page dossier. You put that into a book and then you throw in all these other wonderful details. A lot of these guys could write books. The guys in Journey could write books. The guys who used to be in Journey, like Steve Perry. Why isn't Steve Perry writing a book about Journey? I mean, I guess he doesn't need the money, but it would be fascinating. And now, of course, you've got Mick Mars out there. So, and there are others. There are things like Grand Funk Railroad. I mean, just off the top of my head, these debates, these fights, Creedence. I mean, the Creedence book too, CCR. That would be something as well. Anyway, he says, yes, he did. He called me. He reached out to me. That's Ace Frehley talking about Paul Stanley. Not long after the show was over, and I was blindsided by the phone call because I saw his name come up on my cell phone. I figured he was calling me maybe to apologize or at least explain why he said that. Maybe he meant it really more towards Peter than me, and whatever the case may be. But instead of an apology, I got a 5-second phone call which said, F you, Ace. I'm not going to apologize. And then he hung up. He wasn't even man enough to let me give a rebuttal and explain why I'm so upset or anything like that. The fun of being in a rock band these days, or not being in a rock band. Frehley is out there, though, and he'll sell some tickets to his solo gigs, right? Frehley and the current members of KISS have a history of trading insults. In 2014, Paul Stanley described Frehley and Chris as being like flat tires during an episode of the Joe Rogan podcast. So they're either piss or flat tires. Wow. See, to me, that's not really necessary. These guys aren't in the band. They probably should have made at least one guest appearance during this so-called end of the road. Doesn't look like they're going to. It's really sad. And KISS fans, I think, would like to see it. And it's all fake anyway, right? So I don't know why Paul is worried about what they sound like, because they can make them sound any way they want to, and nobody would know, or nobody would care, I should say. People might know, but they don't care. Anyway, folks, Ace Frehley getting a little publicity here, and Paul Stanley being his usual self, and don't know what Gene Simmons has to say about this. I'm sure he'll weigh in at some point.